I'll be speaking with Benishi Albert, who is co-executive director of the Climate Justice Alliance. That coalition is made up of 83 urban and rural frontline communities, organizations, and supporting networks in the climate justice movement. She's presently speaking to us from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you today?
Good. We saw your recent press release, which is very critical of the Manchin-Biden so-called Inflation Reduction Act. You say that there are benefits in the bill for frontline and environmental justice communities, but, quote, the harms far outweigh the benefits, unquote. Could you explain?
So, there's a number of provisions in there that EJ communities have long fought for, and, things around like reductions to greenhouse gases that can look like. But a lot of what is in there is also tied to incentives for build out and expansion of oil and gas development. And so that's a concern for us. What is in there, both in the actual bill, but also what we're finding out in the last few days, and maybe you've heard that there was also a side agreement that was made around, loosening up some regulations and permitting processes. That piece of side agreement has a lot of harms in it for our communities, and have great concern about that. And so, yeah, while there's some good things in there, and then even on the economic side, some things around prescription drugs and costs for insulin, which would be, great for communities of color. There's also a lot of harms there around sort of expansion of permitting, loosening up or trying to neutralize NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act. And those are things that are meant to protect communities and be helpful communities. And so if those are under attack in a bill like this, then that's cause for concern for us.
Now, in your language, you use the terms frontline communities, but I think many of our viewers don't know what that term means. Could you explain?
So frontline communities are the communities that, one, have been dealing with the effects of climate change for decades now, right? They have been experiencing extreme weather or flooding, or they're also frontline communities in that they live along the fence line or along polluting industries that cause harm to their communities. So, both of those are what we think of being frontline communities, those who are being directly impacted by, in the Gulf Coast, like people are experiencing extreme weather, loss of land, in Alaska and the Arctic area, like people are losing land into the water because of sea level rise. Like these are impacts of climate change that are happening, that are impacting people and have been impacting people for decades.
You say the bill would sacrifice frontline communities to subsidize an outdated industry. What do you mean by that?
The crisis that we're in with climate change means that we need to think about, energy and how we come about that energy in a much more different and dramatic way. We have a country who is its economy is largely dependent on oil and gas development, but that oil and gas development comes at a cost that is not just financial, but as in the impacts to like real communities and a human loss and a human cost. So, we have to be able to think about like energy in a different way and how we come about that energy in a different way. And, fossil fuel and our dependency on fossil fuel is an energy source that we have to like shift and move from and create a transition away from that to other more sustainable and renewable sources that cause less harm to communities. But even, even with the oil and gas industry itself, like, peak oil is a thing. Like, we've been past the point of like peak oil, and now oil is becoming harder and harder to come by. And, they're using much more aggressive strategies to like, get oil out of tar sands and like different things. And so
Fracking and so on.
fracking and so on, because it's harder to come by. So it's the industry itself knows that it's changed, but it's hanging on, and we're subsidizing that. This bill helps subsidize like that hanging on and grasping for straws, when we should be investing in renewable and more sustainable sources that are vetted and engaged with communities, and are led by communities to say, hey, this is the kind of energy that we want, that doesn't cause harm to us, or that is going to help help clean up where there's been pollution already.
Now, you talk negatively about something you call techno fixes. I assume one of those is carbon capture. Can you explain what might be wrong with carbon capture?
Carbon capture, there's a number of techno fixes that are about eliminating carbon from the atmosphere once it's produced. A bill like this doesn't address how are we reducing what is being produced to begin with. Like, how are we making regulations and restrictions on how much carbon can be produced to begin with? And instead, we have these fixes that say, all right, well, once it's produced, meaning like business as usual can go with production, but then we're going to figure out how to erase it from the air. And so, those technologies, many of them also have other secondary pollutions or secondary harms that are caused from them, in addition to like they also allow for the continued production of carbon, and some of them are being put into economic models, which then creates a dependency on carbon having to be produced in order for those to be economically viable for communities. So carbon capture sequestration has a number of technical issues that there are a number of scientists who say it's not even proven that they're effective at removing carbon in the way that they're being promoted and pushed out there. And there's other technologies out there, everything from geoengineering trees to take out carbon more, or putting out like silicone beads on the Arctic ice to reflect the sun. Like, there are a number of these like techno fixes that can cause other problems and other challenges. Instead of us saying, hey, how about we reduce the amount of carbon that we're making and look at energy in a different way.
And I saw on Food and Water Watch, they were talking about how the carbon capture has never been proven to work on any big scale. And the idea that you'd have a whole series of pipelines just for this. So we would have lots more pipelines on whose land, I don't know. Pretty amazing. Now, instead of this, you talk about calling on the president to declare a climate emergency. If he did that, how would that help things?
I believe that declaring a climate emergency would cause agencies, the federal agencies, to have to look at how are we dealing with this as a crisis situation. These frontline communities have been calling for decades, not just years, but decades, saying we are in a climate emergency and we've been dealing with this, and they've been dealing with the harms for a long time now. So they want to see that. I think, for the president to declare that, puts the agencies on notice that they have to do something different. It puts industry on notice that they have to do something different. And it puts communities in a place of saying, help is coming, resources are coming, and here's some ideas that we know are already working in our communities, and being able to have a space to say, hey, maybe these should be considered in other ways for the health and benefit of the nation, right? And right now, you know, this act that is being considered, it almost feels like, oh, if this happens, then we don't have to declare a climate emergency. I think even if the act happened, and I have serious concerns about this act, in its passage, but at the same time, if it does pass, we would still need there to be a climate emergency declared, because we need bold action to be able to deal with the climate crisis in the intensity that it is right now. I mean, people right now, I mean, last week we had floods in Kentucky, right? We have cities across the nation who are having power outages because of, extreme heat and trying to keep cool in their homes. People are losing their lives because of heat and, extreme weather and storms and hurricanes, extreme drought in the Southwest, and that is affecting the like food. So the crisis is being felt right now from the administration doesn't feel like there's a crisis. And so declaring a climate emergency would be a huge step forward in being able to say we need to move and respond in a much different way as a country and as a nation.
Just a couple more questions. Now, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right. Basave Sen, is that the
Basav,
climate? I'm sorry.
Basav Sen. Yeah.
Okay. Basav Sen, the climate policy director at the Institute for Policy Studies, criticizes the supposed net zero 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. What's the problem with this term, net zero?
Net zero means that on paper, you're erasing carbon, right? You're saying this is how much carbon is produced. And in theory, we're saying this is how much will be absorbed by natural forests. This is how much will be absorbed by technology. This is how much will be absorbed by like these different fixes, right? But you don't have a real measure of that. You're just projecting what that could be. And net is not the same as actual zero carbon emissions.
Mhm.
Net is like, this is what we think it's going to be. And if we do these calculations about how much we can, attribute to, nature is going to absorb up this much, or, these techno fixes are going to absorb up this much. So net zero is not real zero. It's just a projection of like, okay, we think if we do these things, this is how much is going to be erased. Now, I'm not a scientist, right? I'm not a scientist, but when I think about the crisis that we're in terms of the carbon in the atmosphere and its effects that it's having on the natural world and as us, I feel like that there's a lot that we need to remove to be able to like right the situation, right? Right now, we're saying like, oh, we can continue to produce at the level we are and still we're erasing this. But I feel like even in removing the carbon and getting to a more appropriate natural balance in the world, it's going to take us a long time. And we will always be playing catch up because we're still producing at the same levels while we're trying to erase from the earth. And so, for me, I'm like, let's have a dramatic shift in how much we're producing so that we can get caught up and we can get to a more natural state of being within this atmosphere. And we're talking about the world, right? We're talking about reducing carbon in the atmosphere of the world. That is not something that's going to happen overnight. And at the same time, unless we start taking bold action, that's also not going to happen in the next overnight. like it needs to happen a lot sooner and a lot more aggressively. And net zero is sort of a greenwashing of like, oh, this is what could happen if we did all of these things. But net zero is not zero carbon emissions. It's net, in what they can like calculate, but it's not the same.
All right. Well, thanks for talking with me. What is the website URL for people who want to find out more about your efforts?
Yeah, there's lots of great information on our website, climatejusticealliance.org. You can, there's a number of fact sheets that people can do. There's some stuff there about net zero for sure. There's a couple of publications there. hoodwinked in a hothouse is one of them. But there's also the people into a regenerative economy, which is a set of values and principles about like, here's what the kind of economy we want to move towards and what we want to build towards and what does that look like. And so there's some information there about the people's orientation. But yes, go check out climatejusticealliance.org, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.